You turn your mode dial to manual mode when you want absolute control over both shutter speed and aperture. You use manual mode usually when you want the light to stay at the same brightness through a series of photographs. For instance, you're using a motor drive and you're panning with the subject, and you want the exposures to stay the same in each one of the pictures in that series. Notice that that is in fact what happened here. You also want to use manual mode when you're shooting a panorama, the idea being that each frame in the panorama has to be exactly the same exposure, despite the fact that you've turned the camera for each separate shot so that when you stitch them together they'll all match up. Another reason to use manual mode is that you may want to choose your own best compromise between a steady shot and control over depth of field. For instance, it was late in the afternoon when this photograph was taken, almost dark as a matter of fact, although the camera is compensated for it. So we were able to both get quite a bit of the background going on here and to get a nice exposure of the shot by being able to have total control over exposure in manual mode. Which brings us to the last point. You want to use manual mode when, for whatever reason, just because you want it that way, you want total control. I wanted to be able to stop the people that were walking down the sidewalk at the same time. I wanted all this fruit in the foreground to be razor sharp, so I needed a small aperture, but I didn't want too slow a shutter speed or all the people in the background would have been blurred. The other semi-manual mode is shutter priority mode. You use it when you want to be sure to freeze motion, when you want to be sure to blur motion, and when you want to make sure that the shot is steady. The overall shot, that is. Here's an example of each of those instances. We wanted to be sure that these cards froze in midair while this magician was working. So we used a very high shutter speed, and in fact we also used electronic strobe, which fires at about 1,000th of a second. When you want to be sure to blur motion, as we did in this night shot. Now, not only is the motion somewhat blurred, but it so happened that the lights in these butterfly wings or angel wings that this woman was wearing flashed on and off. They sort of strobed. And that's why the whole picture isn't a total blur. Instead, we got all the repetitions of each one of those little flashes of light. And finally, you want to be able to use it to make sure that the shot is steady when you don't have a tripod. And here's an instance of that. We wanted to make sure that these leaves on this tree and this windy mountainside stayed nice and sharp, so we used a high shutter speed so that their fluttering in the wind wouldn't cause them to be blurry. And fortunately, we didn't have to use a very narrow aperture because there was lots of fog in the mountainside below, so we couldn't see much of what was behind it anyway, and we didn't particularly want to. So aperture priority mode was a perfect thing to use in this instance.